Hi, my name is Christian Costadenti.
And I'm Angelo Ricci.
We are two students from Chaminade College School, and for our grade 12 AP Chemistry ISU, we decided to create a microbial fuel cell which manipulates organic matter, which in this case is topsoil and benthic mud, to harvest electrons to create clean electrical energy and drinking water. Now, the focus question for our ISU is, using a microbial fuel cell, can the bacteria found in benthic mud and topsoil be used to produce electricity and clean drinking water through the harvesting of its electrons within an anaerobic environment? Now, if an equal mass of topsoil and benthic mud sample are tested, which sample will produce greater electrical energy, therefore inducing a larger current?
Alright, so now I'll be talking about the 4 parts to a microbial fuel cell. So if you look on your screen right now, you will see a microbial fuel cell picture. On the left, you will see an anode. On the right, you will see a cathode. And connecting those two, you'll see a proton exchange membrane, also known as a salt bridge. Connecting the anode and the cathode on the top part of the microbial fuel cell is an external circuit. So what happens first is that the organic matter is placed inside the anode, which is an anaerobic environment. So what will happen is that the bacteria present within the anaerobic environment will undergo bacterial metabolism, and through oxidation reduction reactions, basically what happens is that water molecules and sugar molecules that are broken down by the bacteria, they come together and create carbon dioxide and also individualize into protons and electrons. From there, the electrons get harvested and attracted to by the electrode, which in this case we are using a copper wire because it is conductive, so that the electrons will then be attracted to it. They will flow up the copper wire to the external circuit where the current will therefore be induced, and then from there they will flow into the cathode. So as this is happening, the protons will travel across the proton exchange membrane through what is known as a concentration gradient from high to low. So as the protons travel into the cathode, since the cathode is now an aerobic environment, meaning that there is oxygen present, the electrons and protons and oxygen molecules will combine to form water, and we will further discuss that as the presentation goes on. So now coming back, we're just talking about how we did our project. So we made 2 microbial fuel cells, one where we tested topsoil, one where we tested benthic mud, and we basically tried to find which one produced more electricity. So for the next part of our video presentation, we'll be talking about the hypothesis of our project. So our hypothesis is as follows. If an equal mass of benthic mud and topsoil are simultaneously tested using the same microbial fuel cells, the equal mass of topsoil should produce more electrical energy than the equal mass of benthic mud. So the reason we think this is because, as you know, topsoil is found in the uppermost layer of the Earth's surface, is exposed to vast majority of sunlight, water, rain. It's just a very suitable environment for bacteria to live in. So knowing this, it should only make sense that topsoil has a high concentration of organic matter within it. So contradictory to this, benthic mud is found at the bottom of low-order streams, even some oceans. So in these environments, there's high pressures, low temperatures, and with this, it's not a very suitable environment for bacteria to live in. Therefore, topsoil should theoretically have a higher concentration of organic matter over benthic mud.
So, as we previously stated, a microbial fuel cell is used to extract electrons through oxidation to induce a current. Now, going off of what Angelo said, if an equal mass of topsoil and benthic mud are used, the topsoil should yield a greater current due to it having a greater amount of organic matter. So organic matter and current are directly proportional, as if the concentration of organic matter in topsoil is increased, the current should increase as well.
So the next part of our project, we'll just be talking about our observations. So we actually did create 2 microbial fuel cells. We conducted 2 trials of an experiment, both with topsoil and benthic mud. If you'd like to check out these experiments and the microbial fuel cell that we created, you can check out our last video. So just a brief explanation of our results. So with the first trial of benthic mud, we got a range of 0 to 8,200 millivolts, where for topsoil we actually got a current of 0 millivolts, and just keep in mind that the equal masses of topsoil and benthic mud were used for both trials.
Now for the second trial, we actually registered a constant current in both cases. So for benthic mud, we registered a current of 500 millivolts, while for topsoil, we registered a current of 100 millivolts.
Alright, so now I'll be talking about the chemistry behind the way a microbial fuel cell operates. So within the anode, as we previously discussed, it is in an anaerobic environment. So in a perfectly aerobic environment, bacterial consumption of sugars does yield carbon dioxide, water, and some energy in an exothermic reaction. However, when it is in an anaerobic environment, the consumption of sugars does yield carbon dioxide, protons, and electrons through oxidation reduction reaction. So whenever an oxidation reduction reaction occurs, there's always a loss of electrons. So the general word equation for an oxidation reduction reaction is reactants yields products plus electrons. So within the anode for our microbial fuel cell, we use sucrose as a substrate. So the chemical equation would be C12H22O11 plus 13 water molecules yields 12 carbon dioxide molecules, 48 H plus ions, protons, and 48 electrons. So through this equation, it clearly illustrates that bacterial respiration in an anaerobic environment does lead to the removal of electrons, which will then be attracted to the copper wire and will then be allowed to induce a current. So next we'll be talking about how the electrons do actually get removed from the bacteria. So whenever bacteria or any organism tries to make ATP, which is energy so that they can sustain life, they need to break down glucose. So when they break down glucose, it breaks down into a 6-carbon chain known as pyruvate. From here, if there is a lack of oxygen present, the pyruvate will either get converted to alcohol or can continue to be converted into ATP going through the electron transfer chain. So when it goes in the electron transfer chain, electrons are removed. However, instead of being converted to ATP, the microbial fuel cell through oxidative reduction reactions does remove these electrons and allows it to induce a current. So now that we know how electrons are removed from the organic matter, we can talk about how the protons, electrons, and oxygen produce water. So as stated before, the protons will go from the anode to the cathode through an electrochemical gradient from high concentration to low concentration. So from the high concentration of the anode to the low concentration of the cathode. So as they travel through, oxygen, protons, and electrons will combine to form water in the general equation O2 plus 4 electrons plus 4 H plus ions, also known as protons, yields 2 H2O. So this basically means that 4 protons, 4 electrons, and 1 oxygen molecule will combine to form clean drinking water theoretically. So in the next part of our presentation, we'll be talking about the history behind a microbial fuel cell. So what's amazing is that the potential for a microbial fuel cell has been around since the beginning of time because it's only dependent on bacterial respiration in order to produce ATP. However, the first time that it was actually used to produce electricity was in 1912 when a professor by the name of M.C. Potter, he was a botany professor at the University of Durham. He actually used certain types of bacteria, including E. coli, to induce a current. However, he did not make that much of a current. It was very mediocre, and because of this, he did not get the attention that he deserved, really. However, in 1931, a scientist by the name of Barnett Cohen created the first half microbial fuel cell, and when he connected many of these in series, he created only 2 milliamps of current and 35 volts of energy. Although this doesn't seem like much, it really isn't much. It's just astounding that there had actually been breakthroughs in the microbial fuel cell at such a long time ago. So it was only until the 1980s that the microbial fuel cell finally got the attention it deserved when we realized that we could exponentially increase the current through the implementation of electron mediators. So before, barely any bacteria could be used because they were all composed of a non-conductive lipid membrane, meaning that they could break down sugars and electrons could be removed. However, they could not be transported to the electrode. However, with the implementation of electron mediators, they could use these to tap into the electron transfer chain of these molecules, of these bacteria, and they could be transported right to the electrode in order to produce much more amounts of current. However, since these mediators were in fact toxic and of very high cost, they were not used very much. Arguably, the largest advancement to the production of microbial fuel cells was in 1999 when B.H. Kim produced the first mediator-less microbial fuel cells. So we didn't need mediators anymore to extract electrons. This proved to be much more commercially viable for the mere fact that they were no longer toxic, so they could be used around the world. So the mediator-less microbial fuel cell now, instead of mediators, it uses electrochemically active microbes, which does the job that mediators did, but now you don't need mediators anymore. So finally, in the year of 2007, in May, the University of Queensland in Australia designed a microbial fuel cell that transforms wastewater into electricity and purifies the water in the process. So because of these successes, they've actually started to build a microbial fuel cell that produces 2 kilowatts of power. So although this still isn't an incredible amount of power, it's amazing to see how much more current and voltage that we are actually producing as the time goes on. So maybe one day we can see this power a whole city or entire grid. So just to recap, the two types of microbial fuel cells, the first one is a mediator microbial fuel cell, which uses mediators to tap into the electron transfer chains, while the second one, created by B.H. Kim, is a mediator-less microbial fuel cell, which uses electrochemically active microbes in order to transfer the electrons by themselves. Next part, we'll be talking about application of a microbial fuel cell into society today. So the first one we already know about, it is power generation, which is the entire point of a microbial fuel cell. It induces a current which can be used to power other types of objects. A recent study actually proved that microbial fuel cells have an 85% efficiency rating, and that's astounding because that's the highest efficiency that we've received up to date so far. So although right now not much current has been produced from microbial fuel cells around the world, that's because only small scale microbial fuel cells have been created. But if we can find a way to produce microbial fuel cells that are even larger, this large efficiency rating could one day be used to actually power entire cities, entire nations, and we could use this clean energy instead of nuclear energy, instead of combustion, which yields carbon dioxide, it yields radioactive waste. A microbial fuel cell is completely clean, and the amazing part about that is that we can actually replace and use this alternative energy source as the main thing in our lives. So the next application for a microbial fuel cell would be as a biosensor. So what a biosensor is, it is a mechanism through which concentration of chemicals in a certain area can be detected. So the reason why a microbial fuel cell could be used as a biosensor is because the amount of organic matter present is directly proportional to the current induced. Therefore, when measuring a certain amount of sample, the amount of current produced can actually tell you the concentration of the organic matter in the sample. Another point of application would be as an education tool, because as we know, we created a microbial fuel cell. It's not hard to create, it's not overly expensive, but it does show a lot, it does demonstrate a lot of scientific principles, including oxidative reductive reactions, bacterial metabolism, so many things that can be used to teach, but are not hard to create. A second last thing would be if we modified the external potential inside the anode of the microbial fuel cell, we can actually create H2. We can actually create H2 hydrogen molecules instead of creating water. That's very sophisticated, but as we know it for so far, all we need to do is increase the external potential, and that can be done. So one last application of a microbial fuel cell, which is arguably the most intriguing, is to be used in space. So as of right now, the Naval Research Laboratory has actually created a planet rover that is 1 kilogram and is powered by a lithium-ion battery and a microbial fuel cell. So what's amazing about this is that they work together. So the microbial fuel cell, although it produces low amounts of energy, it can be used to power small things such as a control system, sensors, and electronics, while the lithium-ion battery could be used to power the more important things and the things that take more energy, such as the movement system. So what's actually amazing about this is that the microbial fuel cell could actually be used to recharge the lithium-ion battery, and the reason why it's so ideal for this space expenditure is because microbial fuel cells provide long-term energy and they can sustain themselves for a long period of time.
So next, what our group decided to do was, after obtaining our results, we decided to connect online by finding similar projects and comparing our statistical data to those. So after going online, we found a project by a girl named Jessica Lee who did something similar to us through the creation of a microbial fuel cell, but instead of testing only 2 samples of benthic mud and topsoil, she decided to test 3 samples, which included benthic mud, topsoil, and a marsh sample. Now, with Jessica's experiment, she believed that a marsh sample would produce the greatest amount of electricity in comparison to the other organic matter. With our experiment, we predicted that topsoil would produce the greatest amount of electricity in comparison to benthic mud. In reality, however, both of us were incorrect, as benthic mud was the organic matter that produced the greatest amount of electricity. Jessica even concluded that benthic mud had a concentration of 20% of organic matter in comparison to topsoil, which only had a concentration of 8%. Now, in comparison to Jessica's experiment, our group did not measure sample size, nor did we place a great emphasis on the temperature of the organic matter. However, both experiments did have a general consensus that as organic matter increased, the amount of electricity produced increased as well. Now, this is the case because as organic matter increases, the amount of electrons present in that matter increases as well, meaning that there's more electrons to be harvested, which all in all means that more electricity is able to be produced. Now, in saying this, Jessica's first experiment did coincide with our experiment, for she kept temperature and sample size relatively constant and only measured for electricity in regards to the other samples. Now, our experiment also kept temperature and sample size relatively constant and only measured electricity of topsoil and benthic mud. And overall, our results were quite similar to those obtained by Jessica. Now, in her first experiment, Jessica measured the amount of electricity production right after assembling the microbial fuel cell, similar to what our group did as well. Now, in regards to her results, this is what Jessica obtained. So in her first trial, she registered 162 millivolts for benthic mud, 108 millivolts for topsoil, and 143 millivolts for marsh. In her second trial, she registered 168 millivolts for benthic mud, 110 millivolts for topsoil, and 135 millivolts for marsh. Lastly, in her third trial, she obtained a value of 170 millivolts for benthic mud, 99 millivolts for topsoil, and 134 millivolts for marsh. Now, in regards to that data, you can see that benthic mud produced the greatest amount of electricity, while topsoil produced the least amount. Now, comparing that to the results that our group found, we can say that for our first trial, we obtained a value between 0 and 8,200 millivolts for benthic mud, while we obtained a value of 0 millivolts for topsoil. Then in our second trial, we actually registered a constant voltage, which was 500 millivolts for benthic mud and 100 millivolts for topsoil. So similar to Jessica's results, benthic mud had produced the greatest amount of electricity, while topsoil at first produced nothing, but in comparison to the second trial produced very little in comparison to benthic mud. So now I'm going to be discussing the relationship between the data in which we obtained and our hypothesis, which we stated at the beginning of this presentation. Now, after conducting the experiment, we were able to obtain data in regards to the amount of electrical energy produced. Now, with both fuel cells, the first one containing benthic mud and the second one containing topsoil, the investigation was run for 2 periods of 10 minutes, or until the voltage became constant. Now, during our first experiment, in which we used the microbial fuel cell containing benthic mud, the voltage that was registered never became constant during that 10-minute time frame. However, it did range from 0 to 8,200 millivolts. During the second time period, however, the voltage did become constant as it was registered at 500 millivolts after about 5 minutes. Now, this was the predicted outcome, considering the amount of benthic mud used. For if this was performed at a larger scale, the amount of electricity produced would have increased as well, for the 2 factors are directly proportional. Now, taking a look at our second microbial fuel cell in which we used topsoil, the data obtained was quite different. During our first time period of 10 minutes, no voltage was actually registered when conducting the experiment with topsoil. However, during the second period of 10 minutes, we finally obtained a voltage on the multimeter in which it became constant after about 7 minutes as we registered 100 millivolts when conducting the experiment with topsoil. Comparing both tests, we can evidently state that benthic mud is a better variable to produce electrical energy, as we were able to harvest more electrons from this organic matter in order to produce a higher voltage, thus producing a greater amount of electricity. When relating back to our hypothesis, our group was incorrect. Initially, we predicted that topsoil would harvest the most electrons, thus producing the greatest amount of electricity. However, this was not the case, for after conducting the experiment, benthic mud actually produced the greatest amount of electricity. Now, there are various reasons as to why this may have occurred, and the first one being the amount of organic matter present in the mud sample. Now, initially, our group believed that benthic mud would not contain large amounts of organic matter due to it being at the lowest level of a sea or a body of water, which is known as the benthic zone. And in that case, we believe that organisms or organic matter would not be able to survive at these levels. The one thing that we did not take into consideration, though, was that as organisms die, their carcass falls to the bottom of the ocean or stream, and it decays, giving off bacteria, which is then integrated into that mud. Another thing that we did not take into consideration was the sedimentary rock at the bottom of these oceans, lakes, or streams, which also contain large amounts of organic matter that can also be integrated into the mud sample. Due to these factors, it would seem that benthic mud does have a higher concentration of organic matter in comparison to the other samples. Now, to further prove this, we connected online with another experiment, as I previously stated, the one conducted by Jessica Lee, who found that the concentration of benthic mud was actually higher in comparison to the other samples. Now, organic matter is a huge factor, for it directly relates to the amount of electrons present in the mud samples. The greater the amount of organic matter means the greater the amount of electrons that can be harvested, thus meaning that a greater amount of electricity can be produced. Another factor which may have affected our results would have been conducting this experiment during the winter. In doing so, it could have meant that there may have been little to no bacteria present in the mud samples. With little to no bacteria present, it means that there are also no electrons able to be harvested. Now, in saying that, it would mean that there is little to no chance of electrical energy being able to be produced. Now, these factors may have been the reason as to why such little amounts of electricity were produced in both scenarios. Now, in terms of benthic mud producing a greater amount of electricity in comparison to topsoil, our group concluded that this would be due to benthic mud containing higher concentrations of organic matter. Now, this would be due to the factors which I previously stated, which are that there could have been great amounts of sedimentary rock at the benthic zone, as well as decaying carcasses of organisms that gave off bacteria which integrated into the mud samples. Overall, though, the study that our group conducted was a success, for we achieved our goal of producing electrical energy through the manipulation of organic matter. This opens up many opportunities for not only society but the world, for we now know that a microbial fuel cell can be used as a clean and efficient energy source, something that our world definitely needs. Thank you guys for watching our video. The whole point of this was to educate others on a new and clean energy source that may not be so popular, but is definitely intriguing because of all the great applications that it can have in our world.
Yeah, and another reason why we did this was so that our project doesn't stop here. It lives online forever. We can connect with people who have done it. People who are intrigued about the way a microbial fuel cell works can connect with us. And yeah, thank you for watching it again. One last thing, if you'd like, feel free to follow us on Twitter at @micro_fuel_cell. Once again, I'm Angelo Ricci.
I'm Christian Cosidenti, and we'll see you guys later.